Yes, it's live.
Okay, Ranjan.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Um, Joining me for this research seminar. And as you know, that it's been for the last two lectures that I delivered. Obviously, I all the time maintain that this is a lecture that it's a kind of a research seminar where I'm just trying to give you an exposition, at the same time some elaboration on what exactly is this whole concept of the totality or the literary. That's what I'm interested in. And totality and literary, they are connected because totality, the way I'm looking at totality, and primarily the way I looked at totality with you all in my last research seminar, where Buddhism was on the other side and the other side was Michel Serres. And I was bringing Michel Serres and Buddhism together in a kind of a communication which started to explain that totality is all about not a positive totality, but it's a kind of a negative totality. You know, negative totality would actually mean that it is tensional, it is contradictious, and at the same time, it is very restless. So this is the argument that I'm going to extend a little today and extend farther, because since we spoke on Buddhism, so why not speak on the totality in Indian thought? When we say Indian thought, this is a very I think it's a very restrictive way of putting the whole argument in place. When I say Indian thought, then obviously I mean the classical Indian philosophy. But when I say classical Indian philosophy, then primarily it's the Sanskrit. That's the philosophy I'm referring to. So we do say Indian thought, but that's a kind of a rubric which I think is very restrictive in nature. And at the same time, I think it has the limitations of any kind of conservatism that one may associate with any kind of ideological thinking or philosophical thinking. Now, interestingly, the Christian Gordon's work is something that I'm going to focus on, and I'm just going to just explain what he really has to say about this notion of totality. But alongside, what I intend to do is that once I finish talking to you about the totality, the way totality can obviously be seen in Indian thought, and how that connects with Theodor Adorno, because like I chose Michel Serres the other day, I mean, for this seminar, I'm choosing Theodor Adorno. And why Adorno, you will get to know later, because Adorno had this sort of a tryst with, or you can say a trial with this totality emerging out of Hegel and the post-Hegelian thinking. So we will get to that later. But first we have a kind of a discussion about very interesting ideas that come about totality within the ambit of, I would say, classical Sanskrit thought, classical Sanskrit thinking. Now, if one looks at the word Sanskrit, if you are looking at the word Sanskrit for that matter, then Sanskrit is, the word Sanskrit, if you're looking at this particular word, then Sanskrit actually talks about a principle of completion. Because although we are talking about a kind of a restless totality here, but if you come back to this word Sanskrit, then Sanskrit will obviously mean that something that is perfect. Something that is perfect, something that is complete. This is the meaning of the word Sanskrit. So, yeah, this is very interesting that when I'm talking about early Sanskrit philosophy, I'm speaking about totality, then I'm actually not talking about something that is perfect and something that is complete. Because classical Indian thought, if you're looking at classical Indian thought, then it would actually be like, what should I say? It's a kind of, you might say that the encyclopedia is everywhere, in a general, at the same time in a specific sense. Now, what does that mean? And how would one look at that? If you see that the culture of India, That's the way the Gordon argues. That is, the culture of India is one of plenitude. It is one of presence. It's one of continuity. And all the and on the opposite extreme, if you're looking at, say, for instance, Japan or the Japanese philosophy, then you would see that it is actually a kind of a culture that is based upon the values of emptiness, the absence, and the interval. So on the Indian side, if you're putting it plenitude, presence, and continuity, on the Japanese thinking, if you're looking at the Japanese side of the story, then you would see the philosophical story. Then you would see they are more interested in the values of emptiness, in the absence, and the interval. So when a guru speaks, like Valmiki and Vas, they know that it will take them many scores of verses. They knew that many scores of verses would be needed actually for them to speak and explain a point, because that is the inherent principle of the plenitude, the inherent principle of the plentiful is very much there in the understanding of the Indian thought. But if you're looking at a Zen master's reply, for instance, if you are reading La Tzu and you're just looking at the Zen master's reply to his disciple, then you can see that he has this tendency of giving you a single line anecdote or word, or even silence. So on the inside, if you have 1 million gods, you have almost 30 million gods, for instance, and they're recognized. At the same time, you have hundreds of statues and different sorts, different kinds of variety. But when you talk about the variety, then the interesting argument here is that although I'm talking about variety, or as I mentioned about the encyclopedia, but this encyclopedia is everywhere. At the same time, the encyclopedia is general and particular at the same time. That's an argument that I'm going to focus on. Now, also, one more thing that you find about this Indian thought is that there is a kind of ecumenism. There is a kind of a relentless, almost unlimited syncretism that goes on, because even if one talks about history, even if one talks about culture within this Indian tradition of thinking, this ecumenism and this syncretic incorporation and syncretic co-optation is something that is very much a part of this culture. Now, remember that when I'm talking about these things, I'm trying to bring these things together into a kind of container, a totality. But what kind of totality? What would be the nature of that totality is something that we will unfurl gradually. So, in Hindu, I mean, if you're looking at the Hindu side of it, then the Hindu is not just one who considers the cosmos to be a totality, in which there is one and the same law, that is the dharma in Sanskrit. And they don't consider this to be the dharma or one law. It's that something that starts to regulate the body of the physical, the psychical, and the social phenomena shared by all beings, say animals and humans. But also, above all, one who believes that the dharma affects beings according to their category, or dharma is affected by beings according to their category, if the category can be the varna or the caste. And dharma is the law of the universe. It's the order, but it's an order which is not eternal, but an order that is incessant. So there is a technical difference in thinking there. But since although the universe is destined to disappear, at some point of time the universe will disappear, but it's also destined to be reborn. So if the universe ends, the end is because a beginning is waiting in the wings. So it's a kind of a movement. So there is somewhere this continuity, there is somewhere this inexhaustibility that starts to come up. And at the heart of the dharma, if you look at it, at the heart of the dharma, then you see in every domain or every order has its own dharma, which is the imperative signifier of its essence and thus of its existence. So there is that essence and existence that keeps on working together in the understanding of the dharma. And what would that be? I mean, how would one look at this? Is that it's a very interesting way of looking at the the effect of totality. That I can see something ending, and I know that this is going to end, but this end is just not about a termination. This end is about, on a way, camouflaging, or in a way, hiding or concealing a new beginning. So whether we can really call it the end then. So that is also one interesting point here. Now, it is almost like saying, that we see a monkey in the tree. We see a monkey in the tree, but we only see a part of the monkey in a fragment of tree. Uh, it's almost like saying, we see a monkey in the tree, but we only see part of a monkey in a fragment of a tree. That is, you cannot see the whole tree at one time, the whole monkey at the one time, because that's the way you look at it. So, the monkey and the tree exists. So that is the encyclopedia of everywhere. But when you are seeing it, there is just a perception of the specific aspect of the monkey view or the tree view. So this is what the example sets up. And the whole, say for instance, the Naivishaishak philosophers, this is the whole is not the totality of its parts. I've been telling that in my last seminar as well, because I told you that it is not a totality of the parts. One can see a tree without seeing all its leaves. I mean, you cannot see all the leaves of the tree, but you can at least see the tree. And you can say it's a leafy tree. And how do you get to that conclusion? That's also very interesting, because you're not being able to see all the trees, all the leaves at the same time. But when I asked you whether it was a dotted or a leafy tree, you say it's a leafy tree. So how do you come to the deduction? That is also very interesting. But this is interesting, because if there were no perception of parts, then there would be no perception of the whole. And whatever way one understands it, this is another interesting way of looking at the literary. If you do not see the part, you cannot see the whole. So how is it that you see the whole? If you say, I want to see the whole, then you have to see the part. Only by seeing the part, you can understand the whole. Whether if you ask me whether the monkey is in the tree, now, if that is a holistic understanding, whether the monkey is on the ground or in the tree, then you say the monkey is in the tree. Now, how do you know that? You just see a part of the monkey and you're the part of the tree, and then you come a deduction saying that the monkey is in the tree. So, what you are doing here is that you, by seeing only, or perception only by catering to a part, is actually helping you to understand the whole. So, this is a one very interesting aspect in thought about this idea about this totality that I'm talking about. And for instance, if you look at Krishnamurti, and the philosopher Krishnamurti, and Krishnamurti is talking about fragments, and the question arises that how do you actually live without fragmentation? You cannot live without fragmentation. This is such a difficult thing to do. And every answer that Krishnamurti writes, that every answer derived from a concept he establishes is only an additional fragmentation. So when you are looking at every answer that you derive from a concept, that particular answer is also only an additional fragmentation. And the philosopher will defend the right for man is only is to be freed from the known. So if you are actually say for instance, if you're looking at the Upanishads, now the Upanishad even define this loss within the whole, and even they define this loss within the whole and a fusion with it, which is a kind of a deliverance. And this Indian thought, it has over the years, it's developed this eschatological, or you can say soteriological understanding of totality. Both the eschatology and soteriology of totality is something that the Indian thought starts to build. Now, two words that become important here, and one word is the Vishwa, and the other is Sharva. That is, Sharva is everything, Vishwa is everything. I mean, everything is there around us. So how would you speak about these two kinds of totality that you see there as Vishwa and Sarva? Now, Vishwa would be very extensive, it would be a very extensive, disseminated, it would be a kind of a plural totality. I mean, that's the way if you put it, kind of a plural totality. And Sarva would be very intensive, unified, and integrated whole. I mean, the difference is very interesting. I'll repeat for you. The Vishwa would be very extensive. It would be disseminated. It would be a plural totality. And Sarva would be intensive, unified, and an integrated whole. Now, Vishya is the revealed totality. If you are looking at Vishya, then you will see Vishya is a revealed totality. And revealed totality would actually mean that the continuity is maintained. In some form or the other, the continuity is maintained. So if there is a kind of a revealed totality, then most of the principal gods that you see in the Brahmanic pantheon, they have a name or a quality beginning with Vishya. Now, all the principal gods that I'm talking about, if you say the Brahmanic pantheon, and then you will see they all have a name or a kind of a quality that's beginning with Vishya, like Vishwanath, like the Lord of the universe, whom we call the Shiva. Now, this whole that is expressed by Sarva does not try to include everything. Sarva, as I said, is intensive. Sarva, I said, is unified and integrated whole. So Sarva is not trying to include everything into it. But for instance, Sarvam Dukham, you know, when you use the term Sarvam Dukham and you say all life is suffering, then which actually becomes the first noble truth of Buddhism. Now, it doesn't mean that each moment of existence is painful. It doesn't mean that every single moment is painful, but rather that everything which exists or appears to exist is ephemeral, is transient. So all suffering that the Buddhism talks about, all suffering is a separation. So that's the way they look at it. So there is nothing absolute then, you know, about this opposition between extensive totality and intensive totality. If you consider, well, this is the absolute idea, which is probably the difference that we can come to later, or I can answer some, take your questions on with a contrast with Hegel. But this is the opposition, that it is not a kind of, it is nothing absolute about it, whether you call Vishya as an extensive totality and Sarva as an intensive totality. And interestingly, you know, there's the principal difference that these two words, you know, they're shifted emphasis from one hand, and they are wholly considered global, you know, whose parts are so well integrated that their singularity can no longer be recognized. And the same way that drops of water are no longer discernible in the ocean. So when you look at the ocean, then you see ocean is full of water, but you cannot see the drops of water there. So that is where the intensive and extensive starts to work. And certainly, you know, there is no thought in India that is no more than there is in one European thought, that all things eventually emerge into one. Say all things that emerge into words as Godon looks at it, as the heads in a crowd. They have no face. So when you're looking at the heads of the crowd, then you do not actually see a face, only see the heads of the crowd. It's a big crowd. And if I say it's a big crowd, you do not identify every single face out there. So there is that extensive and intensive totality that comes in. And when you say, well, I have my sister or my brother in the crowd, then obviously that makes a different sort of understanding of the totality. So the crowd is so consubstantial with India that concepts were molded and developed which were without equivalent in the West before modern sciences came in. Like, for instance, you talk about prana. So when you talk about prana, then it's the sum of the energies in the universe. And when you talk about akash, that is the material sum of the universe, that's what you talk about. So there was a school in India, I mean, you can call it the Vedanta Shar, and which considered that the consciousness of the Supreme Lord of the universe is identical in its essence to the total sum consciousness of multiple individuals. Now, the theory of correspondence guarantees that the homology of internal equilibrium through the control of breathing and the macrocosmic harmony, all they come together through the yogic way of doing it. Something that also something that one can connect with Aurobindo's synthesis of the yoga, or Aurobindo's hints to mystic power. I mean, it's the harmonic cycle that one talks about, how you can integrate the two. But that in totality, again, as I said, is very much a plural totality, something that I will call a negative totality when I start to talk to you about Hegel and Adorno. Now, if one looks at sacrifice, then what happens there? Sacrifice, in a sense, those sacrificial acts which the Brahmanas, they poetically glorify. And once you do the sacrificial acts, you count if they are constitute a totality, because in India the whole is likened to a sacrifice, and this civilization is genuinely haunted. The Indian civilization is genuinely haunted by the fear of the unfinished. So when you are talking about sacrifice, it remains in constant danger that acts must be finished. So let everything be uninterrupted. And that is the recurrent motive of the Brahmanas. That is, they want to finish something. Because the real phobia here, the anxiety here, or the contradictious anxiety here, is that whatever we sacrifice, whatever we do, we cannot finish it. There is somewhere this interminability that exists in our acts of termination. So this is very much ingrained within the fiber or the marrow of the Indian critical thought. And totality, it goes from one to the infinite. And say, for instance, in music, when you begin a raga, and when you begin a raga, it seems to continue from immemorial time. I mean, you just can't say that I begin a raga and I begin here. So you specify a point, and when you end the raga, you say here the raga ends. So when it begins, there is a kind of a going back to the immemorial time, as though it's almost materializing out of an act, a sort of a confusion, a sort of an existence that exists, but you exactly don't know knowledgeably that it exists. So this unfinishedness, or this remainder that I'm talking about, these are the two modes of non-totality, and they are completely at the origin and problems that are very much open to tragedy. And the Mahabharata, for that matter, this is a very interesting part that I'm going to discuss with you here. The Mahabharata recounts that how the destiny of Abhimanyu was sealed when he was 5 months old, still inside his mother Shubhadra. Now one evening, Shubhadra and her husband Arjun discussed the future of their son. Follow the story interestingly, it's very interesting. Arjun, who foresees his son's destiny as a great warrior, reveals to Shubhadra a strategic secret that he alone knows the way to penetrate the Chakravyuha, a military formation in a spiral raised to an infinite power, which allows one to encircle the enemy while cutting him off from any possibility of retreat. So he tells that story to Subhadra when Abhimanyu was still in his mother's womb, and Abhimanyu was listening. Now the child listens within his mother's womb, but falls asleep in a course of the tale. He just falls asleep for some time. Many years later, Abhimanyu will know how to penetrate the circle, but will never have learned the way to get out of it. That is something he missed. So it is this ignorance that will cause his death on the battlefield of Kurukshetra, as all of us know. Now, as regards remainders then, from ceremonial meals, for instance, they are the object of painstaking precautions. So a cosmogonic myth like splendidly illustrates how the whole is preserved thanks to the remainder. So that part is missed because he slept, and so he just knew one part of it. So the whole story was there, but there is some part that was left. So Abhimanyu's end is actually a conflict or a contradiction with, in a very interesting totality, where you have the intensive, where he knows how to move in, but there is a remainder. That the remainder is that he missed something there in the whole story. So the totality is that Abhimanyu's going into Chakrapura and fighting the battle out, the Kurukshetra, all these things come together. Arjun and the rest of the people, the Kauravas, the Pandavas, everything of it, they come together to the totality. But there is something that goes missing, and that is the remainder. So, this is interesting because this is the Shesha, when you call it the Shesha, when everything ends. Now, even everything ends, then that Shesha is not the termination here. The Shesha is actually not the real end. The Shesha is actually, what you call it, the remainder. Because that is where the Shesha actually would be, very interestingly, is a kind of a cosmic serpent, Shesha. And cosmic serpent Shesha, whose name means, the name cosmic serpent names Shesha actually means remainder. So when you end something, Shesh, the end, when you end something, that is not the termination, because there is a remainder. So Shesha, or the end, is not inert. The Shesha is very active. The Shesha is extremely productive, but with something that you cannot see. So the Shesha is actually the inexhaustible. That is where the whole thing about totality comes to get a different interpretation. Because when you say totality is the Shesha, that is, it's a server. Everything comes together. So that is where it ends. So it's a kind of a container. But that is not the case, because there is definitely the remainder that works in. And Vishnu, as this pantheon goes, that Vishnu is lulled asleep upon him, Shesha. So Vishnu is sleeping on the serpent, whose name is Shesha. And a night of Brahma thus begins, billions of years on the human scale, during which the image of the old, abolished world is preserved within the God's dream. And when the night is on the point of coming to an end, a lotus stem rises from Vishnu's navel. So when the night is almost nearing its end, a lotus stem rises from Vishnu's navel. And Brahma appears in the middle of the corolla and armed with the Vedas. Now, drawing the image of the vanished world from the dream of Vishnu, he recreates another world identical to the old one. Now, a new cycle can thus begin again. So, Vishnu is still falling asleep on Shesha, but this whole cycle is going on, where you can see that the remainder is all the time there. And remainder is as much an entity as a continuity, an inauguration, and a termination. It is very much a reality that one starts to engage or interact with. And so if the remainder is not inert, then the remainder also has, say for instance, nothing to do with leftovers. So if you are thinking that the remainder is a leftover, no, it's not. It is not something that it's a leftover. No, it's not a leftover. It is on the basis of the remainder that everything can begin again. So this remainder is generative. The remainder can be seen as a category of production. It can be seen as a category of generation. It's a generative category rather than a kind of a waste and a kind of an excess. That is the subtle difference that one needs to keep in mind. So what actually that means is that no thought really ends. No action is ever finished. So if no action is ever finished, which actually means that the totality is never sarva. The totality is Vishya. So if the totality is Vishya, then it is somewhere that you can see the points of exhaustion, but these points of exhaustions are not, in a say, points of termination. There is a kind of inexhaustibility about this whole process of exhaustion. So it is an effectuation almost like a tree, where you got to see the tree, but the tree develops into fruits, and the fruits also result into the tree. So it is almost a kind of a process where um, things really slow down to ripen, and then there's, from the vague and the faint traces, again new acts are born. So it is almost like that. But this very idea is, I find very interesting, because um, there is so much of understanding between the knowledge, the non-knowledge, and how not knowing that where the remainder is, not knowing where the remainder is a guarantee that there would be generation of fresh discourse of knowledge. There's a fresh sort of release of knowledge. So, when you don't know that, how does that happen? So, if one looks at it this way now, I'm spending some time on this because it connects very well with Adorno, because that's the way I have actually framed this class lecture for you all here, research seminar basically. So if knowledge is identical to its object, then universal knowledge is identical to the universe. I'll repeat this for you. If knowledge is identical to its object, then universal knowledge is identical to the universe. So if you say that I know an object, so your knowing of the object, the knowledge of the object is universal, which actually means that you know what the universe is, because the universe is also a part of the object. So my knowledge of the universe is also universal. So I know about it. So the reality and knowing join together. This is very close to, I found, of course, that's what I could connect with. It's very close to the way Adorno looks at the idea of the problem and the reification, how reification can really be overcome. So reification here, even if you look at Adorno's reification, then that is something that can connect with the Indian philosophy, the philosophical part about knowing. So that part is important, but how that knowing can be overcome that's the point that I'm trying to discuss with you. That's a reality and knowing, they come to join together, where one becomes what one knows. And the sole theme of Vedantic philosophy, is the search for the unity. The Hindu mind, in contrast to a Chinese mind, is not interested in the singular for its own sake. It's very rarely that they're interested in the singular. It seeks the general. The Hindu mind is seeking all the time the general. So what is the thing that it suffices to know in order to know everything? This is the sole thing that when one looks at the, say, the Sutra of the Garland of Buddha, if that's the text you are looking at, then there also you develop the idea of the interpenetration. I told you about that in my last seminar. The interpretation of all these mind, universe, Buddha form just one thing. Everything is coming together. Now, this school, especially one of totality, you can consider interpenetration or interpenetrative acts of thinking and action to be a part of the totality. Now, in Buddhist thought, I think I told you about the non-contradiction part of it as well, non-separability of part of it as well in my last class. So in the Buddhist thought, you can also see that there is a fundamental inseparability. And this interdependence of all sensory beings that can be apprehended on the basis of emptiness, conceived as a fertile translucence. Like it's very well put here, the fertile translucence, which is almost like a mirror, which receives and bears a variety of images without the diversity of reflected images threatening the unity of natural luminosity. So it is almost like that, where lots of images are being reflected, but it just doesn't really disturb the luminosity of the image. So you will see that in Indian cosmologies, they are primarily very geometrical. And in contrast to the Greek cosmologies, Indian cosmology is very, very geometrical in nature. And they are built upon structures that are terraced, like the mountain or the cosmic man, or interlocking like the circles and squares of mandalas. So when you look at the mandalas, you will see the circle and squares. So it's a geometric figures there. Now the unity of the totality of being, as in Europe, is guaranteed by the network of correspondences. That's how things correspond. But they combining the enumeration of parts and the systemicity of the whole. That's the way the European consciousness primarily would look at it. Even though the totality is represented geometrically in Indian thought, the interesting part about it is that it is organic and it is not mechanical. It is very organic, even though it is geometrical, but it is very organic. So again, the contradiction is working. That's what I'm actually driving at. So this is shown by the fact, if you see that in Sanskrit, the ongo, when you use the word ongo, it means both limb of the human body, that's the ongo, and also it's a limb of the human body and a part of the whole. It's a limb of the human body. It means both. It means the limb of the human body, and it also means the part of the whole, the ongo of something. So it also means a part. Now the disciplines of the Veda, for example, are called the 6 ongo. When you're looking at the Veda, they're called 6 ongo, which belongs to it as integral parts. Like, what are the ongos there in Vedas? You can say the phonetic, you can call it the metrical, you can say the grammar, you can say etymology, you can say astrology, or you can say the ceremonial. So that's the way the 6 ongos work. Now, even the parts of the temple, if you see the ongos of the temples, they are explicitly related to the limbs of the human body. And just as the body also symbolizes the universe to which it corresponds, each term, whether the Veda, the body, the temple, the cosmos, they are the mirror images of all others. So this is where the point is, and this is exactly the focus of what I'm trying to say here, is how is this contradiction working, where the totality and the part, the specificity and the generality, the sarva and the vishya, how they are working. And the final point here, before I move on to see how this works in the European thinking through Adorno about totality, before we take up a kind of a literary thinking as well, I've decided to bring this idea also to see how you can relate it to your understanding of a literary text or something of that sort. We'll talk about that later. But the final point that I want to talk to you, and I find it very interesting, is the notion of the Bindu. Now, when you say the Bindu is the point, like the way we would put a bindi, that is just a point on your forehead. Now, when you say Bindu, that is the point, then that designates 0, Bindu. Now, yet the same sign also symbolizes the universe. The universe is like a Bindu. And the Bindu, there, if you same sign signifies the universe, then it is actually in its unrevealed form. The Bindu as an unrevealed form. That is to say, before its transformation into the appearance, or rather the world of appearances. That is the Rupa Dhatu, if you call it the Rupa Dhatu. So the manifestation, the emergence of this appearance, it only comes out of the Bindu. The Bindu being actually the unrevealed totality. Now, the comparison of this, the uncreated universe with the point, is due to the fact that the latter is the most elementarily geometrical figure. If you say Bindu, that's a circle, that's a 0. So that's a very elementarily geometrical figure, which is why I said the geometrical figure of the Indian thought that connects with just not a geometrical mechanical way of putting it, but it's very organic. That's what I said. So I'm just trying to drive that point home. It is that this geometrical figure, the Bindu that you see, is actually a very elementarily geometrical figure, but nonetheless this Bindu is capable of generating every other possible figures, and every other possible figure like line or the form or the rupa, as you call it. So the meaning of zero, which is at once a null quantity and the most fundamental arithmetical meaning, a concept, since it's the basis for the most functional system of numeration. Now this is how the Indian philosophers could bring together the nothing and the whole. So this is how the nothing and the whole can come together. And this is how the Bindu starts to make it clear to us that there is something that exists as a kind, with the appearance of a totality, but the appearance of a totality in the sense of a plural totality, the unrevealedness of a totality, and which actually emerges to create this world of appearances, which I said, the Rupa Dhatu. And when that this Rupa Dhatu comes up, you start to get Rupa, the form. So, the form is something that lies within the Bindu. So the Bindu, in a way, becomes the, or to use this term that Catherine Malabau uses, the whole idea of the formability, the ability of the form to form itself, the ability of the form to create or generate its own formations. So this part of the thinking that we have so far come across, it just gives us two ideas here. One is that is somewhere the totality has its own contradiction. The totality is totality is problematical. The totality has a kind of a restivity that we are not very sure of. So totality becomes a kind of a combination of reification and transcendence, a kind of a knowing at the same time an unknowing. But this unknowing also is a kind of knowing, because that actually helps you to know what you want to know. Because let us not see the unknowing as a disqualification here. That's not the way the Indian thought looks at it. Unknowing is not a question of disqualification here. Unknowing is responsible for you to know what you want to know. Why? I will tell you clarify this for you. If I need to know something, then I need to focus on that particular object and know it as an object where my knowledge of the object is terminable. It ends there. Unless I can end my knowing of a particular object, which is about a complete subjective domination of the object, then that particular object cannot be known. But is it that that particular object, by or like the way I want to know it, ends its own meaning? Not at all. There is much more beyond that object that we have not been able to know. But if you say that I don't know what the unknowing part of it, then you will not be able to know the object that you're focusing on. So you know that this unknowing category, you know that there is certain thing, the unknowing category about it. So this unknowability of the object is also responsible for you knowing a particular object. So this this very interesting way of understanding knowledge is very integral, very integral to our understanding of any kind of thing, whether it's a social phenomena, which is why Adorno had a bit of a problem with Marx, and of course with some part of Hegel's thesis. Also, we can consider how a literary text can only be known. A literary text can only be known when you know that there are many other things that you don't know. So the knowing of the unknowing is as important in your understanding of the literary text as it is in your understanding of your social, cultural, political, religious, or your existential life that pans out before you, or your relationship with the world and the relationship with the worldliness of this world. So this is a first part of what I wanted to explain to you. And now comes the second part of it, where I move to Adorno. And when I move to Adorno, then the first thing that I'm going to tell you here is that what is the task of philosophy here? For Adorno, I mean, why I chose Adorno, I mean, the reason why I chose Adorno is my reading of this particular thinker, or reading of my German philosophy for many, many years, it tells me that, you know, philosophical thinking is simply not a part of a particular tradition, which it is, but it's also something has that ability to cross-cut itself, which is about telling you that philosophy has its own negative dialectics to it. And when I say this, what I mean is that when one creates an identity, say for instance, when you are looking at a particular object and you're trying to know that particular object, then you are trying to create an identity for that object. Where my pen here that I'm holding, you're creating an identity for it. So it's a pen. So once I create an identity for it, it actually means that I have a justification for the experience of holding an object. I have dissected my experience of holding an object before I give it a particular identity. And this identity of this particular object is pen. Now, when I do that, then identity here would actually be the other name, which is the way the Hindu thought also looks at it. The identity would be a name for a reification, a very important category for Adorno, where this reification is extremely important. How there is a non-problematized understanding of a particular object that becomes very, very important. So, what can philosophy do? What would be the task of philosophy then? And the task of philosophy would be like the Bindu that I was mentioning. Of course, I'm connecting Adorno with England thought, and Adorno in his entire over doesn't mention Bindu or anything close to that. But this is where the concept, the problem of philosophy comes up. And when Adorno is actually speaking of experience, he is referring to the contours of how individuals interact with each other and with their environment, say for instance the people and nature, and how reification and epistemology can be connected. So reified experience, now that is basically it's a distortion of the subject-object interaction, and there is a complicated thesis of Adorno who looks into the principle of mediation between subject and object. Probably will not have time for a detailed discussion on that, but of course I can take up the questions. But this is the question of the mediation between the subject and object, which it talks about the interaction, and that this subject-object interaction, when it is distorted, it is only then the reification springs up. Now, this cannot be a genuine experience, because if an experience doesn't have contradiction, if an experience doesn't have this plural totality about it, then it just cannot have the genuineness to it. So Adorno then he talks about this reified experience that Adorno is speaking about is when the subject starts to build a kind of, you can say, an instrumental relation with things rather than a responsive relation with things. So if it is an instrumental relation and not a responsive one, then the reification starts to creep in. And interestingly enough, if you put it this way, that reification is actually a being in the world for us, because everything that we do, the way we think literature, the way we look at plant life, the way we look at the life of the non-human, everything is this is the being in the world for us. But this being in the world for us is the other name for reification. And the whole idea is about, say for instance, if you're looking at negative dialectics, then this is what Adorno says, that subjectification and reification, they do not merely diverge. Subjectification and reification, they do not merely diverge, they are correlates. That's what he says in negative dialectics, which I'm reading from. And this manipulation that we do, like understanding this pen is a manipulation that I've effected on this particular object. So when I'm doing a manipulation, I'm using this word instrumentalization. I mean, these are something that really speaks about a reified consciousness with which we live. And this reified consciousness probably for me is more close to the server that I was just mentioning to you rather than the Vishya. Because this Vishya is far more contradictious than server. Server has more integrative aspect to it, and Vishya would probably have more disintegrative aspect to it. So this reified consciousness, it doesn't appreciate that is in fact it's a part of a social process, which normatively it informs its belief and action. That is, you're living within a social system which you consider as reified, but the interesting part is that this very particular society that you are a part of has within itself the methodology and the problematic of overcoming the reification. That is, you consider this to be a Bindu, that's a zero, but which is an arithmetical or numerical way of defining a particular geometric construction, which is probably the fundamental geometric construction. But this fundamental geometric construction also has within it this ability to unhinge itself, this ability to unfix itself. There is this ability to unsettle the whole program of geometric construction. Because if you look at the reification that Adorno is talking about, it is very much a kind of a geometrical structure and something that you can connect with the Indian thought. That's the way I'm doing this seminar for you. So interesting part about is that the essence of the problem of reification for Adorno is that it doesn't allow us to see our world. Now, this reification is proving a kind of an obstacle to see how the world is. That's comprising of subjects, comprising of objects, because and the socio-historical development. Because this, as I said, Bindu has this almost unrevealed wholeness to it, where there could be plentiful or almost multitudinous revealment of different narratives and experiences. And this reification becomes a kind of an integrative, unified way of looking at things. It can become a way of putting a halt to that. It's a kind of an obstacle to the way we want to see it or want to experience it. And Adorno is very much talking about philosophy as a way of experience. So in setting out his account of a non-reified experience, Adorno as he's adopting concepts from the epistemological tradition, but it will be clear that philosophical positions, they unknowingly, they operate with the use of the deepest rational commitments to the societies, commitments about the basic shape of the world and the relations with it. It's not that you are moving out of your commitment to rationality. It is not about the irrationality, the indifference, the incoherence that you start to bring into your thinking. There's very much a kind of a rational submission to your understanding of the world. And what Adorno probably would say here is the idea of the metacritic. Now, when you use the word metacritic, then metacritic is the way to gain access to, say, the socio-historical commitments of epistemology. The socio-historical commitments are so important because now I'm talking about this, your being in the world. So in a reified social world, these reified relations are reproduced in philosophical theories. And the effects of reifications are manifest in variety of forms. And it could be, what could be these reifications? One would be this reduction of the object to a manipulable thing that I told you right now. Then the reduction of the subject to that of a manipulator, like I am the manipulator trying to manipulate an object. And also this comprehension of the current form of relations is natural. Like me, the subject and the object, when I'm looking at it, I consider this to be very natural. Like I consider my relationship with the plant life very natural, because that's the way I'm looking at it, because the plant as an object is manipulative. Engagement with philosophy can only tell you that these are the certain conditions of our experience with life, whether in the form of phenomenology, whether in the form of positivism, whether in the form of empiricism, these are the things that needs a kind of a metacritical engagement. And in trying to do that, Adorno starts to interact with some aspects of Hegel's model. Now, this is interesting because when he starts to interact with this Hegel's model, then one needs to know that what kind of things that Hegel is talking about, and what are the areas that makes Adorno connect with Hegel in a different way. Since I cannot talk about Hegel too long here because I want to end within the next 15-20 minutes, but for Hegel, the problem is that for Hegel, contradiction is very important. And if one looks at consciousness for Hegel, then consciousness, for Hegel, this is a very interesting term that Hegel uses, which I'm going to explain to you a little. That is, consciousness must alter. Consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. I repeat this the sentence for you. Consciousness must alter its knowledge to make it conform to the object. So this must is very important. This particular use of the must, it points to the compulsion of reason. That is, you really have to alter. Consciousness must alter its knowledge of something to really understand an object. So once you do that, you are actually enframing you within a discourse, or enframing yourself within a discourse where you can understand that particular object. So the term then that becomes very important here is the dialectics, which I've been talking about a lot here. The dialectics is extremely important, and when you are looking at the Indian thought, for instance, even the idea of the Bindu with which I ended, Bindu is a very dialectical concept because it is about the contradiction that is inherent in the very idea of the Bindu, or the very idea of reification. Reification is not an inert concept. Reification is very much an alive concept, because reification would have within it this dialectical energy. And Hegel, he describes experience as the dialectical movement of consciousness. And when you use a dialectical movement of consciousness, then the dialectical movement of consciousness, it's very well connects with this experience of responsivity. I told you there would be two things. One would be the knowing things in a reificatory way, and knowing things in a responsive way. So it is where the experience with responsivity comes up. And responsivity, as you know, is not passivity. It is simply not passivity, because in passivity a subject simply receives. In passivity a subject simply receives, and whereas in responsivity the subject dialectically, it reacts, at the same time it adjusts, so it alters the knowledge. So this responsive experience that I'm talking about is kind of experience which is all the time restless, and this experience is all the time rested. Now, few features of Hegel that I would like to mention here. I can elaborate that later if you want more clarifications. Few features of Hegel that I think they are important in trying to understand this Adornian notion of this metacritic, or this Adornian notion of the immanent critic that Adorno tries to bring up. One is the idea that Hegel puts up as, I cannot do all the features of Hegel here in one research seminar, but there is few thoughts that I'm going to share with you in the next 10 or 15 minutes before I end. One is the idea of this determinate negation that it's so important in Hegel. So when one looks at this notion of the determinate negation, then determinate negation is the idea of it's an idea where you can say that the critique of a philosophical claim. Now you make a kind of a philosophical claim, but you build a critique of that philosophical claim, and that it is not leaving you with mere negation of that claim, that you are not making a claim just for a negation. But when you are making that critique of a philosophical claim, then you are actually helping another philosophical position to rise. So it is about you are negating something only to make something rise. So it is about the central, the element of this Hegelian thought about this determinate negation is that it is a critique of a philosophical claim that does not leave us with a mere a negation of that claim. So I'm negated. That would be a positive negation. That is where you are negating something. But there is a determinate negation where it is very interesting. You see the word here. That's the term I want to focus here for people who are not initiated into Hegel. You see the determinate negation. When you say determinate, you are ending something. That's the part. But when you say determinate negation, that determinacy is negated. If the determinacy is negated, which actually means that not only is that particular philosophical position important, but there is also another physical position that your negation of that particular position helps to rise. So this is what it does, and obviously this closely comes to the idea of the responsivity that I was talking about. So what is Hegel trying to do here is that this becomes a kind of a productive contradiction. It's a very productive contradiction. Like the Bindu, again, I'm going back to the Indian thought. Like the way you are going back to the fragmentation that I explained with the Indian thought, where you are looking at saying that where is the monkey? You say the monkey is in the tree, but you cannot say the whole monkey, or you cannot say the full tree. You say the leaves, the tree is very leafy, but you haven't counted or haven't seen all the leaves of the tree. So there is somewhere that you are not being able to know a particular position, but to know that particular position, that position gets negated to produce another position. So there is definitely that a contrast that starts to get built with this determinate negation with skepticism. And very interestingly, very quickly, I just want to mention here that if one gets to read Kant, and of course this entire tradition that I'm talking about, it springs from Kant's The Critique of Pure Reason, and that's where the critique and the analytic seems to rise. But if you're looking at Kant here and looking at how Kant actually looks at a skeptic, that you would see that a skeptic is someone who doesn't stay in one place. Skeptic is somebody who slips from one position to another. So when that skeptic is like an itinerant traveler, or somebody who is a kind of a restive trans locomotor, then it goes from one position to another, and that makes skepticism. I would not say that Kant was very encouraging about that, but this is where the determinate negation and skepticism can be brought together. So the interesting aspect this central pillar of Hegel's thinking about what I'm talking from the phenomenology of spirit here, that it is this Adorno has this kind of a commitment to this particular idea, and I do find this determinate negation of Hegel very much in Indian thought, because this is something that the Bindu for me here, or the whole idea about me talking about looking at the fragmentation in Indian thought, very much allied, or very much something that can be productively discussed alongside this idea of the determinate negation, going beyond contradiction, since it's a reflection on the failure and the revision of a conceptual work. It is the failure of your experience to know something. There is an incompletion and unfinishedness that comes to it, which is why determinate negation would actually be somewhat connected with Shesha, the kind of explanation that I gave you about this word. And what this does is that a materialist and I would say a non-idealist dialectical conception of experience then is something that we are getting here. I say a materialist dialectical conception of experience is one where the subject becomes open-ended. The subject starts to have a very non-systematic relation to objects. So far we were talking about a very systematic relation. Like I was telling you about how would you actually know a thing in its totality? How would you know a thing in its maturity? How would you know a thing has finally ripened to its fullest meaning or fullest significance? That is something you do not get to know. So when that kind of a thing happens, then it is for this reason that the non-identitarian theory comes up, the non-identity of Adorno comes up, and this is the philosophy that Adorno starts to call the negative dialectic, and this negative dialectic is in contradiction to the constructive system-directed dialectic of Hegel. So this is where the difference starts to spring. He loves the whole idea of the contradiction, but here is the difference that starts to spring, where you see Adorno talking about this negative dialectic, but that is in contradiction to this constructive system-directed dialectic of Hegel. So what we try to understand is that the objects as they're irreducibly particular. I use this term very consciously here. The objects are here as the irreducibly particular, and therefore they are not encompassable by concepts which are by their nature universal. So any concept for that matter, bird, or any concept for that matter, like Spinoza for that matter would say there is no, the concept never barks. So a concept doesn't make a noise, and so only that when you materialize that concept, when you start to open up the concept, then the concept starts to bark at you. But the concept doesn't really bark. So it is something that stays. It stays something in its own way, apparently inert. So this is a part that you have concepts that are very universal in nature, but these concepts that are becomes a part of this metacritical experience, and this experience then is something that very much becomes a part of a restless commitment to understanding. So on this note, I would like to end here, because I guess we have reached to the point, because I think it's more than an hour that I've been speaking, and I don't like speaking for more than an hour. But there are many aspects of Adorno that connects with this idea of the totality. But before I end, since I've been able to give you some idea about how this contradictiousness and the plural dialectical totality can really work both in the Indian thought and in Adorno. And if I could do Adorno in more details, then obviously I would be showing you the difference that he starts to build with Hegel. At the same time, the German critical tradition, how it actually interacts with this whole idea of totality. Well, we don't have the space to do it. But before I end, I thought of reading out, or rather just telling you a sloka. Now, I do it very amusingly here. I don't do it here, you can call it ironically, or should I say a little cheekily here, to say that it's a sloka. Now, the sloka reads like this. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. I don't know from which poem, or is it really a poem? Is it a sloka? Is it a kind of a quatrain? Is it something that I picked up maybe while I was driving down a forest reserve, and there was a signpost, and on a signpost I suddenly found that these 4 lines being written, that the woods are lovely, dark and deep, and I promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. So I think it is, what kind of 4 lines are these? Now, there can be people who know that these lines probably from a famous American poet. Some people might say, how is it that you don't know these lines? These lines, how could you call these lines sloka? How could you really say that these are the lines that you saw on a signboard that is just on the side of the road that cuts into a reserve forest? So what do you do with these 4 lines? What kind of totality that you bring out of these 4 lines? What kind of a sarva and what kind of a vishya, or what kind of a principle of Shesha that you get here? And how is it that when you look at these 4 lines, do you really go to that metaphor where I said you're looking at the full monkey or you're looking at a fragmented monkey? Or is it that you come to realize that these four lines written by Robert Frost as part of an American poetical tradition, this is also very much a kind of reification. And if you think that is a reification, then how are these 4 lines taken aside from Frost? First, keep it with Frost because that is where the server is. That is where the positive totality is. But once you take those lines out of Robert Frost, then what happens to these lines? How is it that your reification of your experience of these lines gets its own immanent and metacritical reading? And how then do you bring this determinate negation into your understanding of these 4 lines? Can then my research seminar, the way I have put these 2 traditions together, be executed into your understanding of the literary? Can it really in a way be understood to improve or in a way problematize and aggravate and intensify your understanding of literary imagination? If these are the questions that I've been able to raise in your head, I think this research seminar has had already a good conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ranjan.
I can take I'm open for questions now, so the recording has stopped. So yes, Anuradha, yes. Sure.
Just a minute, Ranjan.
Yeah.
I asked Onik to stop the live also.
Yes, yeah.
Onik, you discontinue with the live session.